Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. Albert Charles Houghton had been born in the idyllic town of Stamford, Vermont, on the 13th of April, 1844, to parents James Houghton and his wife Chloe. He was the last of 9 children. The tiny town of Stamford, Vermont sits just over the line from Clarksburg, Massachusetts in the Berkshires, and offered the gaggle of children ample room to grow. But the kids weren't necessarily normal. Most of them seemed to display a deep interest in business, perhaps fostered by watching their father run the family store, as well as run for elected office and thus serve his community as a politician. As he reached his teens, his siblings all began to move away, either to college or on to get married, and soon young Albert was the only child left at home, and at a time when it must have seemed the most unfortunate. His father began to suffer ill health, and the running of the store had to be taken over mostly by his mother. Albert was the one left at home, looking after his dad, and Albert had to forget his dream of attending law school. But that didn't sit well with him. His dad wasn't healthy enough to work, but he also wasn't so sick that he couldn't be left unsupervised during the day. So, Albert opened his own general store. Not only did he open his own store, but he made it the best in town. And it prospered. He was only 18. Albert had formed a close bond with his brother James Royal Houghton. Just a few years after opening his store, Albert had enough money to ask his brother James if he wanted to go into business with him. So they opened the Houghton Chemical Works, a facility that made red and irons liquors as well as lactic acid, elements used in the making of colored dyes for textiles and printing inks. It made them wealthy, and also offered another form of employment for the residents of their small hometown. Stamford, Vermont wasn't so small, however, that Albert wasn't able to find a lovely wife, which he did when he married Cordelia Smith at the age of 22. She was 21. As Albert began to dabble in real estate in the nearby city of North Adams, Massachusetts, the first of the couple's 6 children started to come along, and in rather short order. All girls. Laura was the first to be born in 1867. She, however, died when she was only 3. Dorina and her twin sister Florence were born in 1869, but little Dorina only lasted long enough to be given a name before passing away and leaving her twin sister Florence as essentially the oldest child. Susan was born in 1872, Alice in 1875, and finally Mary in 1877. No expense was spared when it came to his daughters. Albert and Cordelia made sure that they wanted for nothing, including the very best educations. Albert had bought and taken up the task of running the North Adams-based Parker Mill, a building for the milling of grain, and decided in 1870 to move his family across the border into North Adams. This move included both his parents. Albert bought the Williamstown Manufacturing Company, a textile mill, in 1877. Just a year later, he purchased 2 cotton mills, the Beaver Mill as well as the Eclipse Mill, and upgraded and enlarged them both for the production of the very finest cotton possible. He looked across the border again when he bought yet another textile mill, the North Pownall Manufacturing Company, in the town of North Pownall, Vermont. He enlarged this building substantially as well. Later he took over the running of A.J. Houghton Brewing Company in Boston. Begun by his brother Andrew Jackson Houghton, it was one of the most high-tech breweries of its time, even featuring refrigeration. But upon Andrew's passing in 1892, at the age of 62, Albert added the brewery's management to the long list of his responsibilities. He couldn't stop himself. Albert was a true workaholic, because he soon became a trustee of Williams College, the director of the West End Railway of Boston, director of the Boston and Albany Railroad, president of the North Adams Savings Bank, vice president of the Adams National Bank, director of the International Trust Company of Boston, and director of the Berkshire Life Insurance Company. He had offices in North Adams, New York City, and Paris. It's hard to imagine that he ever had time enough to sleep. But his new hometown was changing, and Albert saw an opportunity. Because North Adams had just been incorporated, having split from the town of Adams, and Albert seemed like he'd make a great first mayor. He liked that idea, and was essentially handed the job. Not only that, but he was practically given his second term without fuss as well. Albert had begun work on a new home just a short time before, his third since he had moved to North Adams. But now it seemed that he should construct it to be fit for a mayor, so ornate neoclassical features were added, and the Houghton mansion constructed from it. The stately home also included fine formal gardens behind it. Their second youngest daughter, Alice, had fallen in love with a man named Edward Wilkinson, who'd go on to become the third mayor of North Adams, from 1900 to 1902. They married on the 19th of April, 1899, and moved into their own home, in town. Their other daughters had married and moved away in the years before, so with the departure of Alice, the only one of his daughters left at home was his youngest, Mary. She was 23, nearing the end of her prime marriageable years, in the eyes of the era, but she'd already set her heart on never marrying anyone, and instead staying in the home to care for her aging parents. Besides, their home was stunning, and constantly visited by friends and family. Large parties were frequently thrown in benefit of local charities, and sometimes the North Adams Hospital. These parties included eligible young men, who were sometimes smitten with her, but Mary never lost her resolve to stay put. Then word came, in 1906, that Alice, only 31, had died. Her family was devastated. A large funeral was held, and she was lovingly buried in Hillside Cemetery in North Adams. This may have been a reaffirming element that helped Mary stay true to her word, as years later, at the age of 37, she was still living at home, and the Houghtons had decided to buy their first car, and in 1914, one of the finest cars available was the beautiful Pierce Arrow touring car. The problem was that their chauffeur, John Winters, sometimes seen written as Witters, was used to a horse and buggy, not automobiles. So Albert sent him to driving school, many of which had begun to pop up all over. On the morning of the 1st of August, 1914, John Winters was back and seemed to have taken to driving like a pro. Albert and Mary decided that it was a beautiful day to go for a scenic drive. Cordelia Houghton had decided to stay at home. Instead, Albert and Mary invited Robert and Sybil Houghton. Sybil and Mary had been close and long-time friends. The journey up the beautiful route to the nearby town of Bennington, Vermont was begun. The countryside, thick with the lushness of summer, greeted them as they rolled along, as did the peaks of the tall Taconic Mountains to the west. They climbed cheerfully the road through Pownall. It was at about 9:30 a.m. that the car and those in it moved up Oak Hill Road and came across some road work there. At a speed of only about 12 miles an hour, and while attempting to pass a stopped team of horses on the car's right-hand side, on the team's left side, Winters brought the left wheels of the car too close to the edge of the road, and the tires began to slip down the embankment there. There were no guardrails, nothing to stop them, and it said that the car rolled a terrible 3 times, a distance of 50 feet, before finally landing on its wheels in a field owned by a Mr. Bates. All the men had escaped with minor injuries. They'd been thrown from the car, but seemed to be mostly all right. Sybil had been thrown from the car too, but had unfortunately landed in its path and was killed when it rolled over her. Mary hadn't been thrown from the car at all. She'd somehow remained inside the open-topped car, despite this being long before seatbelts. But she was far from all right. She drifted in and out of consciousness, but when she was alert enough to say something, all she could do was say how terribly her back hurt. Workmen who witnessed the accident rushed down the hill to check on them, and another ran for a nearby telephone to call for help. Mary was rushed by car by the first doctor to arrive on the scene to the hospital in North Adams, the same one her family had thrown so many fundraisers for. The doctors did all they could, but at 3 p.m, Mary died too. The accident was horribly traumatic for the Houghton family, and for Sybil's family as well, of course. But it was truly hard indeed for poor John Winters, the chauffeur. He was told that he wasn't to blame, and no one really did. The investigators from Vermont told him that it was the unsafe conditions of the road that had caused the accident, that the edge of the roadway had been made unstable by the road work, and had simply crumbled when the wheels of the car had gotten too close. But that didn't console John. Another theory is that because the driver's seat on this model car is on the right side of the vehicle, while passing the stopped team of horses, the embankment would have been on the far side of the car from the driver, and the driver would have had a hard time knowing just how close to the edge of the road the wheels were. Winters also apparently commented that he hadn't been able to clutch in time, but it's unlikely that that would have made a difference once the tires had left the road surface. It was decided that someone should keep an eye on him and stay with him in his apartment in the barn, so the chauffeur of the Wilkinsons, the in-laws of the Houghtons' departed daughter Alice, was sent over. His name was Frank Hacking, and he and John Winters had been friends for years. Frank sat up with John until about 1 a.m., when a Mr. James Haynes took over for him. The daylight had just begun to creep into the sky when John told Mr. Haynes that he had to take care of the horses, who had been rather neglected that day in all of the confusion. Mr. Haynes thought that this was a sign that John was returning to his senses, and let the man go about his chores. A little while later, Mr. Haynes went looking for James. Unable to find him, he called for help, and police came to search the property. John Winters was found in the basement of the Houghtons' barn, dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, with a large caliber gun called a horse gun, used by carriage drivers to quickly kill injured horses who can't be saved. Albert made sure that John was buried in the Houghton family plot, right along with Mary. Albert was indeed hurt in the accident, but seemed well enough to be taken home with what looked like just bumps and bruises. He was expected to recover. Devastation at his young daughter's death, and then the death of his long-time and trusted chauffeur, seemed to have changed that prognosis. He wallowed in his misery, weakening steadily until 10 days later he followed them from this world. His passing probably wasn't a direct result of his grieving. He was probably more badly injured than the doctors could tell back then, but it certainly didn't help. Albert was buried with a huge attendance from friends and members of the community, and laid to rest beside the others that died the day of the crash. Albert and Cordelia's daughter, Florence, moved into the Houghton mansion with her husband, William Gallup, and their son, William Jr., to take care of their aging, heartbroken mother. William Sr. had been taking care of some of Albert's many business ventures even before he died. It had only seemed right that he continue the work. Her only remaining sister, from the 6 total daughters born, Susan, was living in the Troy, New York area with her husband, Andrew McKeon, and their 2 daughters, Florence and Cordelia, named for her mother and sister. She was a frequent visitor, being only a couple hours away by coach and train. When their mother passed away, about 4 years later, the little family stayed for a while longer. But In 1926, Florence and her husband William followed their son and only child to Boston. Many years later, in 1939, she'd pass away in Newton, Mass., 9 years after her husband William passed suddenly while visiting Paris, France. Her only remaining sister Susan would be the longest lived of the Houghton family, passing away in 1955 at the Hotel Barclay in New York City, where she'd been living. But what happened to the Houghton mansion? It was sold to the Freemasons, and it was converted into a Masonic temple. The gardens were built over, an extension of the building constructed atop them. The roof was eventually replaced, and the wood exterior covered with siding, in an effort to economize with more modern materials. But otherwise, the building hasn't changed much. The family's furnishings are, of course, gone. The large, beautiful rooms have been left to become shabby. Some of the plaster is crumbling. The furniture that is there seems to be Mason members' cast-offs, worn couches and folding chairs. Oddities they've somehow come across. An electric chair, non-functioning, of course. But beneath the neglect, you can still see the beauty of this place. And there is something else that hasn't changed. Maybe the permanent residence? Other than for Masonic events, the building was mostly left empty, save the spirits. Yes, it's said that this home is haunted, and mostly by those affected by the tragic drive through Pownell in 1914. Mary is said to still haunt her bedroom, sticking wholeheartedly to her promise to keep an eye on her father, because he's there too. It's been said that his spirit can be seen wandering the home, always the workaholic, looking for something that has to be done. And then there's poor John Winters. His face has been seen peering out of the window, high in the servants' quarters of the home. Though he died in the barn is no longer there, and in his earlier years, he may have very well had a bedroom up in the servants' area. People who've seen the spirit have said he's looked unsettled and sad. Could it be that he still hasn't found peace? There have been dark, rushing shadows, unexplained fragrances like flowers and cologne, voices caught on recordings, strange mists indoors, and numerous other unnatural phenomena experienced by the brave of heart who've ventured into this place to seek out the unexplained. There's one ghost that I can't quite make excuses for. It's said that there's a ghost of a little girl in the basement. But this house was built new. It's not like they moved into an older house where another family had lived before. There had been another house on this spot, demolished to make way for the Houghton mansion. And it's not like that was a shabby house at all. Quite the opposite. It was the home of the Blackington family, another industrious and wealthy family of the area. Could the little girl be one of theirs, a spirit left behind after the rest had moved on? Or could it be the spirit of the Houghtons' first child, little Laura, who died at age 4? Could it be the spirit of the infant Dorina, who left her twin sister when she died so soon after birth? But both of those children were born and died in Stamford, Vermont. Did one or both of the girls follow the family to the new home? Maybe this mansion's been haunted for much longer than any of us assumed. Otherwise, I really don't know who this girl might be, but her spirit has been said to have been witnessed by more than just one paranormal investigator researching the property. Where can you go if you want to walk where this family tread? The Houghton mansion still stands at 172 Church Street, North Adams, Massachusetts, and just a short while ago was offering ghost tours to anyone willing to pay a little and spend a while. But recently, and with little explanation, they canceled such events. Then I discovered why. The Freemasons are selling it. That's right. Right now, as of this recording, June 10th, 2017, for $224,900, you could own this stunning piece of Berkshire history. So it's been occupied by a highly secret society for decades. So it may or may not be haunted. Ghosts are like bees. Treat them with a little respect, don't swat at them, and they won't sting you. I wish with all my heart that I had enough money to buy and restore this place. But all I can do is hope that someone else can see beneath the layer of tackiness brought about by the mason's stay. Sorry guys, but it's not like an electric chair or a closet full of swords adds a touch of class. And see the real quality that was planned into this fine building at its conception. I hope somebody loves this place as much as I do, as much as the Houghtons did. Enough to bring it back to the splendor that it once was. I hope someone loves it enough not to divide it into apartments or condos. This house is a gem, even if the ghosts aren't real. It's a beautiful representation of the early years of the city of North Adams, and of a family and a man who helped build the community that it was, who invested his entire self into the creation of industry for the region. But if you don't have $224,900 to spend on a house, which I must say isn't actually that expensive when you're talking about house prices, you can always visit Mass Mocha. This modern art museum is housed in one of the many establishments that Albert owned and ran long ago, and the price of a ticket is much less than the price of the house. This has been The Berkshires Gone By, created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter, where you will be treated to a picture from Berkshire history every day. You can also find us on Facebook, where pictures from our past, as well as every episode ever made, can be found. One of the easiest places to find every episode is, of course, on YouTube, just by searching The Berkshires Gone By. Or, if you want specific pictures dedicated to each topic of every episode, and every episode we've ever made, you can visit www.theberkshiresgoneby.com. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.